By the time Blast has its TGE, I think I will have 0 of my 13 brain cells left. For those of you who don't know, Blast is the first native yield L2 from the same builders that created Blur, the NFT marketplace. The thing that makes Blast fairly revolutionary is the simple fact that you are earning native yield on your ETH and USDB that sits in your wallet from Lido-staked ETH and MakerDAO respectively. That and Blast arguably has the most attractive environment for builders looking to get exposure to a new user base through the Blast Gold incentive programs. Blast has been on mainnet since February 29th and was slated to have its token generation event, or TGE, later this month. However, Blast announced on May 15th that it would actually be delaying its TGE until June 26th. Additionally, it announced that the allocation of redacted going to users would increase and that we will see 2 more Blast Gold distributions from now until June 26th. Now, everyone has feelings about this, but let's take a closer look at what's actually happening in the ecosystem and what it means for those who are currently active on Blast and for those who might be on the fence about jumping in. Now, personally for me, I'm bullish. I acknowledge the fact that, I may have some bag bias as someone who has pretty much spent every waking moment since late February in the Blast trenches. But at the end of the day, I just fundamentally think that Blast will be a more efficient chain for most DeFi experiences, and that the native yield actually just opens up so many new revenue streams for builders and ultimately will usher in new metas. So zooming out, yes, there will be dilution as there is more gold that's being distributed than anyone initially anticipated, but the actual allocation amount of the Blast token going to users is being increased to make up for that. Pac-Man also announced that the delay for the Blast TGE was basically caused by a need for more time on the engineering front. This to me signals that we should expect something either day 1 or shortly after TGE. Potentially some sort of product or ecosystem announcement. At least that's what I have up in my brain. Whether that's staking or a new dApp that gives this token that's launching some sort of new utility, like who knows? Could Pac-Man potentially be launching the institution-grade perps platform he's been teasing about since November 2023? I don't know. It's all up for us to wildly speculate on. But for me, a few things became clear. 1, you're really only going to feel the effects of dilution if you stopped being engaged with the ecosystem. 2, gold is going to feel like it's much easier to get versus how it's been historically, because we know we have more gold coming in future rounds as well as the Blast jackpots. I've also chatted with a few of the builders on Blast, and the Blast team is meeting with various teams on mainnet to basically discuss and provide feedback on their incentive systems. So I think we're going to also start to see basically more platforms really start to drill in on how exactly they're going to reward gold. And number 3, while it may seem like Blast is oversaturated on the timeline, again, to me, on-chain data continues to paint a different story. And now with all of that said, here is part 1 of the study assignment for this video. I want you guys to give me your honest take on Blast and or share how your experience on Blast has been thus far. So moving on, NFTstats prediction for Blast Gold has gone down from $10.68 per gold bar to $6. Obviously, as we're seeing this stuff come out on the timeline, people are not thrilled. But I think as we continue to speculate wildly for the next month, it's important for us to separate social signaling versus what's actually happening on chain and what the data says. And I figured no better person to break this down with and look at stats with than NFTstats himself. Well, Sam, thank you for joining me on a Saturday. Appreciate you making the time away from the kiddos. How are you?
What is up, Jen? Always good to talk to you. You're killing
yeah.
it. So I'm honored to be on this in this moment.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. So obviously in the last couple of days, there was some pretty big news from Blast, mainly this TGE being delayed by a month. I wanted to get your read on it and get your take on it. How are you feeling overall?
I've been very vocal about my Blast Gold prices. Like that's kind of something I've sort of randomly stumbled into, like people looking at me for. So, when they did this, I was like, damn, everything I said is wrong. That was my biggest issue. I think my farming was a little bit more aggressive that in the beginning than it is now. And I think that early people tend to get diluted a little bit. And this is not new for stuff that Pac-Man has done. I think there's a little bit of this with Blur as well. One thing that was really surprising to me though is I did talk to him about this, and he said, "Look, like we know we have to put an end date." And so that we started saying like day one, they're like, this will be over in May. So I know that this was something they took seriously and they really wanted to get it done. So I was a little bit surprised because I am sure this was not what they wanted.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because you were talking about how, you were quote unquote wrong, but I think had there not been a delay and had there not been another Blast Gold distribution, I think you were right on the money. Correct me if I'm wrong. The estimate basically is based off of like what what the FDV is going to be at launch, how much allocation of whatever this redacted token is going to gold, and then how much gold there is in terms of total supply. Like those are the three factors, right?
Yeah, and because they publish a doc every time they release gold, you know exactly how much is out there. So it's a little bit easier to do. And for people listening who don't know what FDV means, that is valuation. So it's basically what's the valuation of the token when it launches, how much of that token is going to go to gold holders, and how much gold is there. And from there, you can back into like a price.
Yeah, so you came out with this new estimate from I think $10.68 down to 6. Can you like quickly walk us through like the math to get here for the folks who aren't fully aware?
Sure. And it's confusing, but I'll do my best. So the biggest thing is how much gold is out there. And this is the part that, they said they're going to give more token to holders as a result. What do they mean by that? So, there's 100% is the total token. And the way that they generally do this is that first bit that gets released when the token launches, with Blur, they only gave 12%. In that first month, only 12% of the total token outstanding was given to Blur farmers. That was my prediction for Blast, that they'd give 12% of the total token, not outstanding, the total token that existed. I thought they'd give 12% to Blast farmers. I think now they're probably going to give 15%. How do I know? I don't. I have no idea. No one knows anything. But that is my guess. So they're giving more to people as a percentage of all that will be outstanding. So that's like the good thing. That would make the gold price go higher. The problem is that they're creating a ton more gold. Why are they creating a ton more gold? Well, there's just much more gold inflation now than there was in the beginning. In the beginning, like in March, they did a drop that had like 10 million gold. Then, 5 weeks later, they did another one that had 10 million gold. Well, now the drops have 15 million gold, and they say they're doing 2 over 4 weeks. And then the second piece is jackpot. Jackpot didn't exist in the beginning, and now it exists. And that's probably, emitting, I don't know, that one's hard to say, but maybe 6 to 8 million gold. So between the jackpot and the 2 more drops that they've committed to, that just means that all the gold that they created earlier is where it has a much smaller piece of the pie. So that was what really brought, that number from like 10 to 6. And then the other piece of it is, L2s have been a little bit weak. I said that my guess for the valuation for this was 12 billion, and I changed my guess to 10 billion, just a little bit lower, because if you look at Optimism's token price, if you look at Arbitrum's token price, like they've just gone down. They're down like 50% in the past 3 months. I think those are the easiest comparables. I'd say that this variable is the single hardest one to know, but I think that if I had to guess, and obviously, again, I'm putting this all in I have no idea what I'm talking about category, but if I had to guess, I would say that I think 10 is a little bit conservative.
Well, and I think here in a little bit, we're going to look into some of like the Blast stats versus other L2 stats. But before we get there, you put out this pretty interesting tweet that I wanted to just quickly take a look at as it related to points, because I think I remember when Blast first came out, it was like 1 Blast Gold is 36,000 points, and now like 1 Blast Gold is 107,000 points, but then there's like point multipliers factored in, and this I was a little lost on it. Could you break this down?
I am entirely lost on this too. The biggest problem was that 36,000 number meant no one to anyone. So when people came out and, I responded, people were like, oh, they just downgraded gold to points. And I was like, you can't downgrade gold to points from something that made no sense in the first place. Not a single person. There isn't a single person in the world who knew what that 36,000 meant. And here's my basic take. That 36,000 was released the day that gold was launched. And I think their goal with creating that was to be like, guys, you've got all these points. Well, gold's worth more. Go farm the shit
Yeah,
out
yeah,
of
yeah.
this. Go do these
It,
things. And
because
everyone's like,
that
whoa.
was like the big messaging was like gold is infinitely harder to earn. It's infinitely more valuable than points. That was like all of the
Exactly.
marketing messaging around it.
You're spot on. So they put that number in there to convey that to people, but then they
Mm-hmm.
never changed that number as multipliers came in. They never
Yeah,
changed that
yeah,
number as inflation came in. So I think what they had to do is they had to update that number in a
yeah.
way
Mm-hmm.
that like made it make some degree of sense. And I
Yeah.
think what that new number is basically they're saying if you get to the 24x multiplier, if you get to that multiplier, how much will each gold be worth then? Like if you have a 12x multiplier, which I'd say most people probably have, 1,000,000 points, according to my estimates, would be worth $112. If you have a 14x multiplier, that means you have more points. So those more points are going to be worth less per points because you got more points now. That doesn't mean you made a mistake. I had some people be like, oh, I should have never done the multiplier. I'm like, no, because now you have more points. So they have to be worth less because it's not like money just appears out of thin air. Although sometimes people think that does.
I mean,
Uh, I mean, I know exactly, but yeah. So if you have a 14x multiplier, then 1,000,000 points would be worth $96. So
but you
that
have
was
more
kind of where I
points.
landed. I'm
Yeah.
self-conscious that no one listening has any idea what I'm talking about, but
I mean, I don't think anyone listening has any idea what anything is happening. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of
yeah,
why I was like I just felt like I needed to get on the phone with you because I was reading this and I was like I like to think I'm smart, but I am so fucking lost. And so I know I
I,
can't be the only one who's like lost
I
in
like I
this.
was literally going crazy reading my comments that morning. I don't know why I let this stuff get to me. I don't know why I let it get to me. I was reading these comments. I was like, God, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. And also, just like if you're gonna leave that ratio, you got to say what you're. And you also have these multipliers that are changing for everyone, and your ratio doesn't change as those multipliers go higher. You got to put a little bit of an explanation in there. Like as I was
Totally.
listening to Pac-Man, I was like, I'm not even sure he knows what he's talking about because he still is not really tying these knots together. Like I think his assumption here is that that's what that's what your gold will be worth per points once you get to 24x.
Okay, so like with that said, like obviously there's been some reactions to this TGE delay, to the dilution, to like these new estimates coming out around gold. But I do want to take a minute and like zoom out and actually look at some stats with you about like where we are right now in the Blast ecosystem because I think as high as the emotions are on the timeline, I still think people aren't actually like fully comprehending what's happening by looking on chain. And so some of the things that I just thought was interesting, and I mentioned this in my State of Blast video, but it's like we're so worried about dilution and yes, obviously it's coming, but it's like it's not like you're being diluted by new capital. Like I'm looking at the total ETH volume and like what the daily volume is and it just feels really steady to me. Like we haven't really seen any massive like capital influx. Like are these things that you're looking at as you kind of like create your thesis around Blast? Like are you feeling bullish, bearish? Where are you at?
Yeah, I mean, it's like when people say things like, "Oh, our points are getting diluted by multipliers." I'm like, the only like, so here's the thing about points, and we'll get to this. This is a separate thing. Half the airdrop is going to gold, and gold has very weird supply dynamics. Half the airdrop is going to points, and the only thing that
Mm-hmm.
dilutes points, and it's really hard to get points diluted that much because 6/7 of it's already finished. But the only thing that would dilute points is someone bridging like $1 billion. Okay, so
Mm.
and as you show here, there's not a ton of ETH coming on, and I think that's the world we live in right now is one where like some people love Blast, some people just kind of believe in it, some people reluctantly are like, damn, I'll just go because Pac-Man makes people money. Like but those people have already made up their minds. And I don't think we're getting a ton of more capital into Blast right now. And I think that the inflows and these numbers would show it. Like you're not getting like farmers are bridging a little bit more, but you're not getting tons of capital inflow into
Mm-mm.
Blast anymore. This is why I think the TG is important. I think you need to shift the narrative away from like invisible points to okay, they have a real token that's trading on Binance or Coinbase or whatever it's trading, and like that's liquid. I can convert that into money that I can use to pay my dog's vet bill, whatever. Like I really
Yeah.
need to get to that stage.
Well, and so this is what's also interesting. It's like the DeFi TVL, which is like all of the money that's actually locked up in protocols and smart contracts, has like really just stabilized. And
Mm.
then I asked Riza, Riza, I hope I said that right, to put together this like L2 landscape because I think like that's the other thing too. Like you were talking about for your Blast Gold estimates, kind of using Arbitrum and Optimism as like your baseline for FDV. I thought it would be really interesting if we could actually look at like where we actually are. Obviously, a lot of like the daily active wallets are on Arbitrum, but if you look, it's kind of crazy. Like Blast is slowly getting there when it comes to Optimism. Like I just thought this was interesting because it's like Blast is clearly the fastest growing chain. We see Blast having like pretty high user retention in comparison to Arbitrum and Base. Like Blast users were pushing on average more transactions than any other ecosystem. Even though the volume isn't here, it just feels like the activity and attention is here, and it's just hard for me not to be bullish on something like this.
Yeah, I'll take the other side of this one. If we're talking about how Blast should be getting the same fully diluted valuation as Arbitrum and Optimism, but there's just nowhere near the amount of volume on, not volume, there's nowhere near the amount of money bridged over. If you look at some of these charts, it like user retention's not as good as Optimism. Like I think because there's so much less capital on Blast, like for you to make the argument that Blast should be like getting the same valuation multiple as Arbitrum and Optimism, like everything else has to be blowing it out of the park. Like growth has to be blowing them out of the water. User retention has to be blowing them out of the water because the amount of cap money on there, I think from the chart you're showing is like much, much lower.
But the time to reach 500,000 users was much faster. Like yeah. I agree with you. Like we're not quite seeing the exact like same stats, but I'm also just like Blast has been on mainnet for 2 months, and like how long have these other networks been up, and to see how rapidly it's growing in terms of like catching up, I would say from an activity perspective, not a volume perspective. Like if we take out Arbitrum, like this is the Blast volume compared to Optimism.
Yeah, but go to Arbitrum. Okay. All right. So I'll try to answer it with this. Okay. So if you're looking at this chart, like Arbitrum only has a $10 billion fully diluted valuation. So if you're going to say that Blast should have the same valuation, like here you can see that there's a lot more going on. I think like Zai and a bunch of other chains are on Arbitrum. So right now Blast like is way behind at least Arbitrum in terms of volume, but we're saying it should get the same valuation. And in order to say that, you just have to say that the growth is just blowing it out of the water. And I'm not even convinced that that's totally true. Like Blast was very quick to get to a lot of users, but that was all very front heavy. And the growth is really declining pretty sharply right now. Like I said, like I think people are either in or they're out at this point, and there's not tons of growth. Like, yes, there's a lot more, like people are clicking a lot more on Blast because like there's a ton of farming going on. So I don't think like these numbers to me don't get me too excited about like a $20 billion valuation relative to what's out there. What does is the fact that like, one, this is a narrative game. And I think that the narrative and the attention economics of the situation are like hugely positive on Blast. It's not like these aren't like dividend paying assets like Google or Facebook, right? Like, there's a weird kind of logic people use for what creates valuation in L2s. And I'm not fully sure what it is, but broadly speaking, I don't think the numbers really get you there. I think the things that get you there are attention economics, narrative, and the fact that only 15% of the fully diluted valuation is going to be floating. And I think so you're going to have so the market cap, if you actually look at the market cap on a $10 billion valuation, it's like 1.5 billion, which is like what flow is. Like if you actually go and see what are the 1.3 to $1.6 billion market cap coins on CoinGecko, you're going to see a lot of stuff that like you haven't even heard of. And here we're talking about the biggest story of the year, arguably one of the most controversial stories of the year, one of the founders who is one of the biggest names of the year. I just think at the end of the day, like liquidity dynamics make this more valuable. But look, I'm a Blast bull. I got almost all my money on Blast, but I also come from the equity research world, and it's a huge one of my absolute favorite tweets ever was from D Farmer. And he said, the reason that people from the traditional world can never compete with us is because they first have to unlearn everything they've ever learned before ever. And I sometimes I run into that as someone talking about this space.
Oh my God. I mean, this is why we call you our Web3 boomer dad. I mean, like
Let's
in point.
Exactly.
I mean, so it's obvious that like we're both very bullish. I don't know if I think I stand by my interpretation of the stats of like I think there's a lot of room to grow, and I think like to your point the narrative does need this magic internet money to turn into something tangible, and I think that's just going to be like rocket fuel for the ecosystem. I'm
Yeah, I
like
feel like the world of Blast is divided into two types of people. Like I was doing a daily news show about Blur throughout their entire rise. So you
mhm,
have people like me who and you who really followed Blur closely, and we know what the playbook looks like, or at least looked like in that case. It could be different
yeah.
here, and we know at least in that case, it was season two that was really what brought the fuel to the fire. It was like this is not going to let up the minute this event happens. It's actually going to get even bigger, and you're going to get more news stories about it because of the token launch.
But like speaking of which, like okay, taking another step back, and we've seen how this playbook goes before. I've said it multiple times. I don't think Pac-Man has like revealed all of the cards up the sleeve yet, and I feel like we got a hint of it a couple of days ago when he was like, basically the reason why we delayed TGE is because of an engineering lift that's required for something that we want to do. Um, I don't know if this is staking. I don't know if this is institution grade perps. Like, do you have any fun speculations on like what this could possibly be?
I mean, I think look at what they've built now. They've built this crazy ecosystem with gold and points, and everyone distributes it in their own way. And you have this jackpot thing now, and they've created this like kind of incredible ecosystem that somehow all works together. Like, yeah, there's a lot of tech lift there. So even
Mm-hmm.
just doing what they're doing, if they want to come out with something new for season two, like that's a lot of tech. And like, they just launched jackpot like a week and change ago. They just launched Blur. Like they've got a lot of stuff they're working on, and I'm sure just more of the same could be coming with season two, and that takes tech. Like launching your token takes tech. I mean, we know over at Meme Land that you got to negotiate market makers, you got to negotiate with exchanges, you got to get your investors on board. There's a lot to line up, and I just think like adding 26 days to this to me it's. I was making a big deal of it because all my estimates became wrong, but existentially, I don't think this is like holy cow, they're gonna do something crazy. I just think even Blur, they tweeted March 15th coming in April, just to launch an exchange they already had on Blur on ETH on the
Mm-hmm.
Blast, and it ended up taking them till the very last day of April to do it. So I think here they're just like, damn, like we're just not ready yet, and let's give ourselves
Mm.
26 days. It was interesting, like they gave themselves a hard date. They had already done that with May, but they're like June 26th. We're not
Yeah.
fucking around this time. So I'm not reading as deep into it. I don't think, I don't know. It makes sense to me that even in the absence of some existential change, that they needed more time to get their tech lined up.
Mm. I think that's fair. I think I'm just gonna be over here in my little like degen head speculating wildly because I just
There
to your
could be. I
point,
mean,
they've set this date, and I feel like there's no way that they weren't working on stuff leading up to this date. And to your point, I also feel like it has to be close. It's probably undergoing audits. Like audits can take weeks. Like who knows? Like
if there's a yeah, MakerDAO. I think that they need to get rid of MakerDAO. I think they need their own yielding token. I shouldn't say to get rid of them. I think ultimately it doesn't make sense to be funneling $1 billion into MakerDAO. So I think there's
mhm.
other stuff within the infrastructure that they want to do. But I mean, that's another example. Like he told you on your podcast at NFT NYC. When was that? Like March or April?
April,
I
beginning
mean,
of
he told
April.
you
Hmm.
the beginning of April. Yeah, he told you then that jackpot was coming. He's like, I mean, he
Yeah.
didn't say it so much, but he's like, look, we need something to reward assets. It took him 6 weeks to crank it out. It took
Hmm.
6 weeks. It made jackpot. It was just literally something that it's a slot machine that gives like that's a big lift, but that took 6 weeks. Like
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that they added 26 days, I don't think is like a sign that the world's about to change. I just think everything they do, and you're right. Like, I mean, talk about what would destroy this platform, like a security breach. So
Yeah.
like all the audits they have to do, it just, I don't know. I'm not reading too deep here.
All right. Well, I think you brought us back down to earth. Thanks again, Sam, for taking the time on a Saturday. And yeah, I hope this. Do
Thank
you have
you
any
for all
like
you're
last
doing for the
words?
ecosystem. I think this ecosystem benefits so much from you. And like I've said this time and time again, like the game that you are in content is about finding a wave to ride and then just riding it to all the way through, and you're crushing it. So appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So for me, obviously really cool to get to have stats on to go through some of that stuff on chain together. I think if anything, that conversation just reaffirmed the feeling that Blast is going to take people by surprise after TGE. Again, as of right now, we haven't seen any massive influxes of new capital on Blast yet. So you have to ask yourself, especially with the extra month to get exposure before TGE, like, do I think that this is a good opportunity to get exposure to this new ecosystem? Does this ecosystem have staying power even after incentives? And for me, the answer to that is yes. So with that said, let's go over the last part of the study assignment for this video. Lastly, I want to know a bit about why you're here. Not necessarily on Blast, but why you're in crypto or in Web3 or why you chose to be a participant in this space. I've gone ahead and set aside 0.5 ETH and a few Blast native NFTs, including a Blastopian, a Blast Hood, and a MetaStreet Apollo NFT for this study assignment. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. Don't forget there are 2 parts to this assignment, and this will run for 1 week and end on May 27th at 3 p.m. PT. If you are participating from YouTube, please do me a favor and find this video on my X profile and comment from there. And that's a wrap for this one. June 26th, you know what to do. It's time to lock the fuck in. Bearish or bullish, keep building, keep farming, keep learning. Until the next one, guys.